Hello, welcome to this video that we're doing at the Self-Investigation, being produced in the context of the massive open online course we're doing with the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas, and it's called Mental Health and Journalism, How Journalists Can Responsibly Report on It and Take Care of Themselves. If you're not part of the MOOC, but you're interested in it, I suggest you look at the information at journalismcourses.org. Let me introduce myself. I'm Mar Cabra. I'm the co-founder of the Self-Investigation. I have a past as a journalist, as an investigative reporter and a data reporter. And that part of my bio I share with the person I'm about to introduce to you. We have an amazing expert on well-being. Dave Seglins works at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in a role called Wellbeing Champion. But he shares, like me, a past as an investigative reporter. Let me welcome him here on this conversation. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Mar. Thanks for having me. Thanks for asking.
So, Dave, you've been an investigative reporter for many years, but since April 2022, you are journalist and well-being champion. What's all that about?
Well, after those many years, 25 in journalism, I shifted focus. And so, but I didn't want to give up being a journalist because it's so much part of my identity. It's the part of any journalist that I know their identity. You know, you don't just stop being a journalist. It's the way we see the world. So I wanted to stay as a journalist, but I wanted to work in mental health and well-being because I saw huge areas, not just within my own employer, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, but across the industry on how we do our work. So what does it mean? It means I'm an advocate. Internally, I'm also an advocate in the industry. I've begun studying mental health. I've been looking at other projects around the world, things like what you're doing to explore how we can enhance mental health learning and support within the news industry. So I'm a peer, I'm a trainer. So my job is kind of split into three pieces. I do training, and then I build supports within the CBC, everything from counseling and peer support. And I'm also working externally with other partners in the industry to try to find ways to elevate and lift up the well-being of journalists across Canada and hopefully internationally.
And we're going to get to talk about that in a second, a bit more in detail. But first, I wanted to ask you, what made you change from investigative reporting into well-being?
A decade ago, I had a really terrible experience where after covering an intense court case, a criminal trial of a serial killer, I crashed. I had a total breakdown. It was later diagnosed as a post-traumatic stress response. And I've been dealing with that and getting healthy and thinking about that and doing some therapy and talking it through and getting better for more than a decade now. But that experience taught me that I was so ill-equipped. I didn't know what was happening with me at the time. No one had ever talked to me about it. In fact, to this day, very few people at my workplace, even though I'm public well-being champion, have ever asked me about it. We don't know how to talk about this in our industry very well. And I hope that's changing. So your question is, how did I become it? Well, I've thought a lot about this over the years. I did a little bit of writing. I appeared on a few panels. But over the pandemic, when there was such an acute stress on everybody, not just within the news industry, but in the news industry, our leaders and our managers and our editors realized, like, whoa, mental health is under a serious strain. And it's not just the pandemic, it's the layering of everything. So if our jobs, we deal with trauma and tragedy and we work under intense pressure and deadline, and now we've got the pandemic. But also there was something else going on at the time, which is around racial reckonings in the world, where Black Lives Matter. In Canada, for instance, there's a reckoning with our Indigenous history where there are terrible stories as we confront how our country has treated Indigenous peoples. And that left someone like me, a senior white guy, wondering, what can I do to help improve the experiences of our people? And so I thought to myself, I'd like to get into training. I'd like to get into trying to make the working lives of our journalists better. And so I went to our learning and development department and I said, I think we really need more training on mental health and well-being. And they said, great idea, because boy, do we ever need it. And all of our editors they want something, they need something. And I said, yeah, but I'm not an expert. I have my lived experience, but what do I know? And they said, well, learn. So I looked around and I started looking like, okay, so where are the courses that teach people in journalism on how to become well-being experts? And there aren't many, to be honest. And because it was the pandemic, the DART Center, its fellowship program was shut down. But on their advice, they said, well, there is a program at Harvard Medical School that is designed for frontline international relief workers, aid workers who deal with traumatized populations. You could take that. So I did. And I got a certificate in global mental health and trauma. So this is a very long story, but taking all of that, I went to my bosses and I said, I think there's a lot of work to do. We could help our own people, we could help the Canadian industry, and we could help maybe lead some new efforts to help with the training around the world. Why don't we create a job? And I said, I still have to be a journalist. I don't want to be a manager. I don't want to be, an egghead expert up here. I want to still occasionally do journalism, but I also want to be this well-being. And so I use the word champion because I can't think of another way to express it. It's a little bit odd, but that's because the job is unique. So I'm pleased to be it.
Thank you, Dave, for such a detailed explanation. Many learnings in what you shared for those who are thinking, I want to do the same thing in my news organization. You also studied mental health first aid through a course of the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and there are courses on this topic in different countries around the world. So that's another course that people might take. I think that probably in that journey, you actually realize that having data and having facts was key, right? And as a former data reporter, I know about that. And you're actually one of the authors of a report that recently came out called Taking Care, a report on mental health, well-being, and trauma among Canadian media workers. And it's based on the answers of more than 1,200 Canadian journalists. So you did get the data. What were the highlights of their answers?
What was striking in the findings are the levels of exposure to trauma and traumatic events. This is what we do in our jobs. We cover terrible things. Most people in the news business don't cover happy stories. So what struck me is that 2/3 of all of the media workers and journalists, and we include in that group, camera people, video editors, people who are working inside newsrooms on the copy desk, not just people in the field. We all are exposed in different ways to stories of murder, stories of natural disasters, stories of human suffering. 2/3 of respondents report negative impacts. And that's a lot. And if you start to look at it, over the last 4 years, a huge proportion of our respondents suffered burnout, anxiety, depression, trouble sleeping. So those are the kinds of numbers that make you go, wow. I think there are some challenges with our study. People who are going to fill out a survey about mental health may be predisposed to thinking about it. So there may be there may be a bias in the study. But for us in Canada, to have 1,200 people participate, more than 900 of them filled out the entire survey, every single question. That is a high level of engagement. So even so, if you've got 2/3 of them, that's 600 people in our industry in this country who are reporting these negative effects. I think that's something really important to pay attention to. And I'll touch on 2 other things. I'm not surprised, but this documented and gives us numbers about people's feelings about their work. People love their jobs. but they feel very resentful and they feel very insecure in the way they are treated and the way the issues around mental health are dealt with by their employers. So there's a lot of toxic distrust in the news industry, we found. And I don't think that's unique to Canada. We hear this around the world, but this is what our Canadian survey results say. And also what it helped establish is that there is a lack of expertise. Even in the respondents who were managers and supervisors, very few have ever had training in mental health. Very few have had training in trauma. Very few have had training in how to deal with an employee who may be negatively affected, covering terrible stories. And so it speaks to the need for this kind of education, the kind of discussion that you're helping to lead and instruct.
And we're seeing the same thing around the world. In the past 2 years, we've trained about 2,000 people in English and in Spanish at the self-investigation on these topics. And I'm seeing the same thing, whether we talk to people in Colombia or we talk to people in the Philippines, you know? So actually it's clearly a widespread issue across different cultures too. Anything positive or anything reassuring about what you saw?
Think about it. If 900 people took 20 minutes of time to fill out every single question, what does that tell you? It tells me that people want to talk about this. People want to fix these issues. They're concerned about, their mental health. So that's a good thing, right? One of the things that we found is that of our respondents, I think 52 or 53% say they have already sought medical help to deal with stress related to their jobs. I found that extraordinary. I actually find it encouraging, but and a little bit surprising because I don't think we talk about this. So, to the extent that I felt alone when I was having my own struggles, I think lots of people feel alone, but it turns out we're not alone. Lots of us are struggling with this. We also found a generational shift, that a lot of the really negative attitudes and, just suck it up. And, that's a bit of the older worldview. Among younger journalists, people more recently joining the profession, they tended to be more open, more comfortable talking about their mental health. So that's a positive thing. It bodes very well for the future. And ultimately, I would say our participation rate overall, having 1,200 people, just I was very encouraged by that.
Let's learn a little bit, Dave, about how you do it at the CBC. And you told us a little bit about what being a well-being champion means. You convinced your bosses to give you that role in April 2022. So you started a few months ago and have 1 year to prove them that this is so needed that you need to do that until you retire or so. So what have you been successful on so far?
Development of a course, a day-long workshop, and getting our senior leaders to make it a priority. So we are now starting to deliver it. And we do it in small sessions. We do it in groups of 8 to 10 people. And we have hundreds of journalists across our country. So I have my work cut out for me, but building the course was a huge success, and getting it now functioning. We've been very successful in applying it to major stories. So we do lots of advanced planning for major stories that we know that will be upsetting. So I've worked with teams that are covering a big judicial inquiry into a mass shooting here in Canada. Our teams that are dealing with Indigenous residential schools in Canada. There was a trip that went to the Vatican for an apology from the Pope. The Pope is traveling to Canada in the summer of 2022. And we're working with those teams to make plans. Let's talk about it beforehand. Let's get a before plan on what is taking care of our well-being while covering this intense story. Do we have enough resources? How will we check in? Will people be getting enough sleep? All of this before, during. What's the plan for how we're going to ensure well-being after? So implementing those kinds of practices on big stories. And we now have specialized counseling, which is rare There are few services in terms of EAPs or clinical psychologists who specialize in working with news professionals or journalists, but we have found a company that is helping supply some of that. And so we're building layers upon layers of support for our people, from education to counseling support to changing the way we do planning on big stories. And then there's the external piece of what we're doing. We have an industry group here in Canada. We have a pilot project with a newsroom underway where we're developing a new training module that if the pilot works, we're going to try to share it widely across the industry so that other newsrooms could emulate it easily and you know, so that we're not all reinventing the same wheel all the time. So those are some of the successes.
And what are the challenges? Because I guess some things must not be easy.
My first challenge was my own fear, right? There's a lot of distrust in our industry. We're also very competitive. And to do the job well, you have to appear that you can perform, like you have to be able to fulfill the needs of the newsroom in a high stress time. So even talking about it, fear is a challenge. The culture, right? Just get it done. Suck it up, you know, deal with the story, but don't worry about the human cost of working 12, 14, 18-hour days, right? The culture of the place is really good, and I say the place, but I mean the industry, is really good at prioritizing the story. It's not very good at prioritizing the storyteller. So those are huge obstacles. And look, I do an exercise, and perhaps you do it in the courses that you teach, but we let people talk and we say, what are your stressors, right? And we name them all. And what are the barriers to well-being in our industry? And what is the number one thing all the time? Well, there's two things. It's deadlines and time. Nobody has any time for this, right? So saying to people and my organization, I want people to have a day where they can do nothing but participate in this workshop. Who has time for that? That is a huge challenge, but we have to make time. If we're going to change, we actually have to be intentional and say, okay, we're going to make well-being a thing, and we have to build it into how we do things. That means changing.
And as we say at the self-investigation a lot, you are as important as the work, if not more. And that's a mantra that I have to repeat myself many, many times because I have many years of the wires being connected in the wrong way. Before we go, I want you to give advice to those people who are listening to you and thinking, I want to do the same thing. You talked to us about trainings you got, but what would be your advice so that they can really move things inside their newsroom or inside their journalism community?
Read, get educated, like start to learn, and your course is great. There are some books I would recommend, you know, everything from New York Times bestseller, Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk to I love David Morris, The Evil Hours, former journalist, war correspondent, gets PTSD, and then he goes on a whole self-discovery. What is PTSD? And he does a whole examination of what is trauma, what is mental health. They're great lessons for any journalist, regardless of whether you want to be a well-being champion. But you do have to start getting wise to what is stress, how does the brain work, but more functionally and practically. Look for allies, find the bosses and the supervisors. Nobody thinks well-being is a bad idea, right? Everyone thinks it would be great if we had everybody feeling excellent at their jobs and feeling good about getting to work and doing it in a way that is healthy. What people don't know how to do is how to get there. So just propose it. Just say, hey, I'd like to learn some more about this. I would like to take on a leadership role. And it doesn't have to be a full-time job for a year. It could be, how about we get in a guest speaker? How about we hold a session where we just sort of talk about, you know, what's working for people, what's not working for people. It's about creating space, and you can start very small. You know, it may not be a job with a salary to begin with, but by exploring it, professing your interest in it, and helping colleagues find ways to talk about it within your newsroom, it can start to grow. I'll tell you one other tiny other bit of my lived experience. It was during the height of the pandemic, and I had two really heavy stories on the go, both of them involving death. And, one was COVID, one was an industrial accident. And then there was another one thrown at me, a breaking news story involving death again. And I was like, I can't handle this. And when I went to my bosses initially and said, you know what, this isn't healthy for me. I can't do this additional story. I was told at that time, well, that's not the way it works. You can't say no to an assignment. And I thought to myself, okay, as a 25-year veteran who's lived through lots of experiences and have been somewhat public about what has happened to me, if I can't put up my hand and say, hey, we need to rethink this because this isn't healthy, doing these kinds of stories all the time with accumulated trauma and all the stresses we're going through in the pandemic, if I can't raise my hand and we don't have a proper way of talking about this in our workplace, then nobody can.
Let's end looking forward. And where would you want us to be in, let's say, 5 years?
5 years, I won't be doing any of this work anymore. I will be back doing huge investigations, breaking stories, doing what I love, because there won't be need for this, because this will be baked into how we do things. It's normal to talk about, are you getting enough rest? Or, stop working 15 hours a day. We subsidize the news industry with our own well-being. This is what I've come to believe. We love our jobs. We're so passionate for our stories, our sources, our people, the causes that drive us. But we do it in a bad way. And with my goal in 5 years, I'm not that optimistic, actually. So in 5 years, I will hopefully see some of the culture change that we're trying to bring about, and there will be more well-being champions, and there will be better routine training in newsrooms, and we'll be much further along, and there will be fewer people suffering anxiety, depression, and burnout, and all of the negative things that come from the way we're doing our jobs currently.
Amen to that, Dave. Thanks so much for all the wisdom that you've shared, really from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.
Amen. Thanks for asking me.